From cave wall hands to the printing press, empires rose in a giant mess. Silk road spice and a compass spin. Humans kept inventing trouble again. A pharaoh blinked and a kingdom fell. Romans built roads and aqueducts well. Mongols rode through half the earth, changing maps for what it's worth. We mapped the stars, crossed every sea, argued on what gods could be. Trade, revolt, philosophy, history's one big conspiracy. It all started with a buffer. Wait! The Buffer History Podcast, where timelines crash and cultures talk back. From Delhi courts to Viking raids to Cold War spies and samurai blades. We got revolutions, treaties, kings, tiny events changing everything. One bad border, one coup, one chart, and suddenly the whole world falls apart. So gather round, don't lose the plot, cause history's way weirder than we were taught. The past ain't dead, it's broadcasting live on Buffer History tonight.
Welcome to the Buffer History Podcast. Imagine for a second that you are a young, intensely charismatic soldier.
Right.
And you basically take over one of the poorest, most exploited nations on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Almost overnight, you defy the most powerful global superpowers. You stare down the barrel of international finance, and you completely transform your country in just 4 years. I mean, you're vaccinating millions of children in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it's incredible.
You plant 10 million trees to hold back the desert, and then you are betrayed, murdered in cold blood by your absolute best friend.
Your brother in arms.
Exactly. In this shadowy plot that involves international spies, warlords, and foreign mercenaries, you might think I'm pitching a script for, like, a geopolitical espionage thriller.
It definitely sounds like one.
But this is real history.
It is. It's the story of Thomas Sankara and the Burkinabè Revolution. And to pull this apart today, for this deep dive, we are cross-referencing declassified 1980s French intelligence reports, the recently unsealed 2015 autopsy of Thomas Sankara, and modern geopolitical analyses.
Yeah, because we're also covering the current explosive realignments happening in the Sahel region of Africa right now.
Right. Because the sources we're looking at don't just treat this as the past.
No, not at all. We are diving into this because it is a literal masterclass in how global geopolitics actually work behind closed doors.
Absolutely.
It shows you how international debt is used as a weapon of war. And it reveals, in really stark, bloody detail, exactly what happens when a leader tries to fundamentally break the global system.
And like we said, this isn't just distant history from the 1980s. The sources highlight that the exact same anti-imperialist spirit is erupting today.
Right.
Yeah, through the current leader of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He's essentially using Sankara's playbook to reshape West Africa as we speak.
Right. So to understand the sheer magnitude of what Thomas Sankara attempted and, well, why he had to be eliminated, we have to look at the economic ground he was standing on.
Mm-hmm. We have to go back to the 1950s and 60s.
To a territory the French colonizers called Upper Volta.
Yeah, and the sources note that the name itself tells you everything you need to know about how the territory was viewed.
How so?
Well, Upper Volta was just a geographical label applied by bureaucrats thousands of miles away in Paris.
Yeah.
It just noted its location on the upper part of the Volta River.
So it wasn't even seen as a real nation.
Exactly. It was an administrative zone.
Yeah.
And under French colonial rule, which, continued long after its nominal independence in 1960, the region was engineered to be a reservoir of cheap, expendable labor.
The sources are really clear on this. We are looking at a society engineered purely for extraction.
Purely. I mean, in the 1960s, you had a rural illiteracy rate of 98%.
98%? That's just wild.
Yeah, and the average life expectancy was 40 years. Infant mortality was the highest in the world.
It makes me think of, like, the mechanics of a company town. Imagine you're living in a town where the company owns the houses, they own the grocery store, and the bank.
Right.
You work your fingers to the bone, but you are paid in company scrip, which you can only spend at the company's store.
At prices the company sets.
Exactly. And the wealth generated by your labor never stays in the town. It's continuously siphoned off to corporate headquarters. That was Upper Volta on a macroeconomic scale.
That's a perfect analogy. The French system pushed poor farmers into this massive migration network. They worked as cheap, bonded labor in the cash crop plantations of neighboring countries like the Ivory Coast.
All to serve foreign capital.
Yes. And the financial mechanism locking that company town in place was the CFA franc.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is crucial.
It really is. The CFA franc was the currency imposed by France on its former African colonies. The rules of this currency required these African nations to deposit a massive percentage of their national reserves directly into the French treasury in Paris.
Wait, so they had to keep their own money in France?
Yes, and the currency was pegged to the French franc, meaning Paris, not the local capital. Ouagadougou controlled the monetary policy. Paris controlled the exchange rates and the inflation rates of Upper Volta. So if the country wanted to build a road or a hospital, they essentially had to borrow their own money back from France.
With interest, I'm assuming.
Of course, with interest.
That's insane. So there was no local middle class to build a domestic economy.
No. There was only a handful of local chiefs acting as enforcers for the French administration. They presided over millions of, well, super-exploited workers.
And that is the specific, brutal environment Thomas Sankara is born into in 1949.
Right.
His family lived in what historians describe as the normalized rural poverty of the Sahel. He had this really attentive mother who instilled a fierce sense of dignity in him.
Yeah, that dignity is a recurring theme in all the texts about him.
Totally. And he would later tell a story, this is in the source material, about a man from a local village that perfectly captures the psychological toll of this extraction.
Oh, the bicycle story.
Yeah. So the region was suffering through a brutal drought. The villagers pool every single coin they have, the collective wealth of the entire community. And they trust this one man to ride his bicycle all the way to the capital to buy food. He makes this agonizing journey, but when he reaches the city, his bicycle and all the money are stolen.
The village's only lifeline just vanishes in an instant.
Vanishes. The man is trapped. If he goes back empty-handed, he watches his family starve. If he stays in the capital, he starves alone. Overwhelmed by absolute despair, he hangs himself.
It's devastating.
And the craziest part is, the local authorities in the capital didn't even investigate. They simply dug a hole and threw his body in. They recorded him on the paperwork as, quote, useless weight.
Useless weight. Yeah, Sankara asked a question after that would basically define his entire life. He said, do we have the right to turn our backs on people like this?
That tragedy really crystallized the disconnect for him. The disconnect between the suffering of the rural poor and the utter indifference of the neo-colonial elite in the cities.
Exactly. And, you know, Sankara's family couldn't afford to send him to a prestigious university, so he ended up in a military academy.
Which is interesting given his later trajectory.
Well, the military, at that time in post-colonial Africa, was fundamentally designed to control the labor power of the producing classes.
Right. It was the enforcer.
Yeah, so the blunt instrument used to put down strikes, break up protests, and ensure the company town kept producing.
So he is recruited into the inner workings of this massive exploitative machine. He gets the uniform, the training, the inside access.
But rather than taking his officer's paycheck and just, you know, enjoying the privileges of the elite, he begins studying the system's vulnerabilities.
It's like a corporate whistleblower. Someone on the inside of the machine who realizes the entire industry is rigged and decides to use their inside access to dismantle it.
That's a great way to look at it. In 1966, he's sent for advanced officer training in Madagascar, and he arrives right as the 1972 popular uprisings explode there.
Talk about timing.
Right. He witnesses students and workers flooding the streets and actually toppling the neo-colonial government.
And while stationed there, his political education just accelerates dramatically. The sources say he's reading Marxist political economy, he's diving into the guerrilla warfare theories of Che Guevara.
And studying Amilcar Cabral, the revolutionary who fought the Portuguese in Guinea-Bissau.
Yeah.
He's watching the Cuban Revolution and the Vietnamese resistance.
He synthesizes all of this geopolitical data and arrives at this foundational conclusion for his movement. He says, a soldier without political training is a potential criminal.
Because he realized the military was a weapon pointed at his own people.
Right. If you just give a man a gun and tell him to follow orders, he will inevitably be used to oppress the vulnerable. You have to educate the soldier on class, on economics, on imperialism.
So he understands who he is actually supposed to be protecting.
Exactly. So Sankara returns home, and over the next decade, his profile skyrockets.
He fights in a border war with Mali in 1974. And he actually publicly criticized the war, calling it useless and unjust.
Which is pretty bold for a military officer.
Very bold. But his tactical brilliance on the battlefield turns him into a national hero anyway.
Yeah, the sources describe him as this young, handsome officer. He plays guitar in a local jazz band, rides a motorcycle through the capital.
He had an incredible charisma. He spoke directly to the massive youth population and the powerful trade unions.
And that popularity terrified the political establishment. By 1981, a military regime actually pressures him into taking a government post as Secretary of Information.
They were hoping to co-opt his popularity, basically, bring him inside the tent.
But they fundamentally miscalculated.
Think time.
Sankara uses the national platform to advocate for press freedom. And when the military regime begins cracking down on striking labor unions, Sankara does the unthinkable.
He goes on live national television, resigns his post, and declares into the camera, "Woe to those who gag the people."
He paints a massive target on his own back with that.
Oh, absolutely. By late 1982, another coup puts a moderate doctor named Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo in power, and Sankara is reluctantly made prime minister just to keep the public happy.
But he doesn't play nice. He immediately begins flying around the world, giving fiery anti-imperialist speeches at non-aligned summits.
He even invites radical leaders like Libya's Muammar Gaddafi to visit without even consulting the president.
The French government watches this and completely panics.
Yeah, according to the declassified files, on May 16, 1983, the French president's chief advisor on African affairs lands in Ouagadougou. The very next day, Sankara is arrested.
They thought decapitating the movement would end it.
That's always the playbook, right?
But instead, arresting him triggers an immediate massive popular uprising. The youth, the unions, the urban poor, they flood the streets of the capital, completely paralyzing the city, demanding his release.
The regime is forced to move him to house arrest.
Yeah.
And this is where the historical mechanisms shift from civil protest to armed revolution.
Right, because Sankara had spent years cultivating a deeply loyal, highly trained faction within the military. And the most crucial figure in this faction was his absolute closest friend,
A fellow officer named Blaise Compaoré.
On August 4th, 1983, Blaise Compaoré mobilizes a group of 250 insurgent paratroopers. They march from their base straight onto the capital.
And the masses in the streets actively support the soldiers. They're actually guiding them through the city.
The regime completely collapses. Sankara is freed, and at the age of 33, he takes power as the president of the National Council of the Revolution. The revolution begins.
And he hits the ground running with an intensity that genuinely shocked the international community. Sankara famously stated, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness."
That madness was his absolute refusal to conform to the subservient role designed for an impoverished African nation.
Right. He understood that colonialism wasn't just an economic structure, it was a deep psychological prison.
So his very first major act was to shatter those psychological chains. On the first anniversary of the revolution, he officially erased the colonial name Upper Volta.
He replaces it with Burkina Faso.
And the etymology here, the sources point out, is a masterstroke of nation building. He pulls from the two major indigenous languages of the territory.
Yeah, Burkina comes from the Moray language, meaning integrity or upright, and Faso comes from the Dioula language, meaning homeland.
He fuses them together to create the land of upright men, or the land of honest people.
So the citizens are no longer voltaics, defined by a French bureaucratic map. They are Burkinabè.
This renaming was the linguistic anchor of a new philosophy called Burkinabè,
which centered entirely on self-esteem, self-reliance, and sacrifice for the collective community. He was engineering a massive shift in national consciousness.
operating on the theory that a population cannot build an independent economy until they fundamentally believe they are worthy of one.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, though, because psychological liberation is great, but it doesn't balance a national budget. You have a country that is entirely dependent on foreign aid.
And Sankara's core platform is an aggressive, uncompromising rejection of that exact aid.
In the 1980s, the IMF and the World Bank were aggressively pushing what they called structural adjustment programs onto developing nations.
And the mechanics of these structural adjustment loans were just devastating.
The sources outline this really clearly. The IMF would offer a struggling nation a massive influx of cash to avoid defaulting on its debts. But the cash came with draconian conditions.
Right. The borrowing nation was forced to privatize its state-owned assets, selling off water, electricity, telecommunications to Western corporations.
They were forced to slash public spending, which meant gutting healthcare and education budgets.
And most insidiously, they were forced to reorient their entire agricultural sector away from feeding their own people and toward producing cash crops like cotton or cocoa for export to the West.
And the revenue from those exports would then go right back to Western banks to pay the interest on the loan. It's a mathematically perfect trap.
It really is. And Sankara saw the math clearly. He categorically rejected IMF loans.
He stood up at an Organization of African Unity summit, and this speech is legendary in the source material. He told a room full of African heads of state that debt was a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa.
He explained that the very people lending the money were the same people who had enslaved and colonized them.
And now they were using financial instruments to turn African nations into financial slaves. He pleaded for a united front, warning that if Burkina Faso was the only country to refuse to pay its debts, he said, "I will not be here at the next conference."
He knew the risks. To survive without that foreign capital, he had to implement total endogenous development. He had to close the loop of the economy.
He delivered a famous speech asking, "Where is imperialism? Look at your plates when you eat. The imported rice, maize, and millet. That is imperialism."
It makes sense. Think about your own supply chains today. If your basic daily survival, your food, your energy, is outsourced to entities you have no political control over, you have zero sovereignty.
They can starve you into compliance at any moment. So he radically reorients the land. The government nationalizes all land and redistributes it directly to rural farmers.
Stripping the traditional, often corrupt tribal chiefs of their feudal control.
He shifts the entire agricultural focus away from export crops and mandates the production of domestic food staples.
And within 4 years, Burkina Faso becomes completely self-sufficient in basic food production. It's staggering.
To fund his social programs without the IMF, he institutes revolutionary austerity. But the texts emphasize this wasn't the kind of austerity that starves the working class.
No, Sankara targeted the political elite. He slashed his own presidential salary to just $450 a month.
He lived in a modest brick house with a mortgage.
He famously rounded up the government's entire fleet of luxury Mercedes-Benzes, sold them off, and mandated that the Renault 5, the cheapest, smallest car available in the country, would be the official state vehicle.
The effacement of privilege was visceral. I mean, the sources share this incredible anecdote. He once invited his wealthy, highly privileged cabinet ministers out to lunch.
Oh, this is a great story.
They show up, likely expecting a lavish state banquet. Instead, Sankara takes them to a place called Yidigri. It's a cheap, working-class restaurant near a local hospital.
They eat modest portions of local food, and then when the bill comes, Sankara refuses to use state funds.
He forces every single minister to pull out their own wallets and pay for their own meals. And he doesn't stop there. He forces them to pay for the meals of their drivers as well.
It was a highly calculated public humiliation of the elite. It was designed to send an unmistakable message to the Burkinabè masses. The government is no longer a vehicle for personal enrichment. It is a mechanism for your service.
And by reallocating the funds previously drained by elite corruption, his administration executed staggering logistical feats. The most famous is the Vaccination Commando.
Right. We are talking about a country with almost no paved roads outside the capital, minimal electrical grids, and a massive rural population spread across brutal terrain.
Traditional bureaucracies would take years just to study the logistics of a mass vaccination program. But Sankara bypassed the Ministry of Health entirely.
The logistics were military in their precision. He mobilized the committees for the defense of the revolution. These were local grassroots groups organized in every single village.
They partnered with Cuban medical volunteers who had experience in rapid rural healthcare deployment. They mapped out cold chain logistics to keep vaccines viable in temperatures soaring over 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
They mobilized youth on bicycles and on foot to reach the most remote outposts.
And in exactly 15 days, they vaccinated 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. The infant mortality rate instantly plummeted.
It's unheard of. And his vision for public health extended to the very earth they lived on. He recognized that the advancing Sahara Desert was a literal existential threat to the survival of the nation.
But the sources note he didn't frame environmentalism as a charity project. He framed it as anti-imperialist defense. He argued that global colonial extraction had stripped the land of its natural defenses.
So he launched a massive reforestation initiative. Over 10 million trees were planted to create a green wall against the desert.
He mandated that no one could randomly cut down wood for fires without authorization, and he banned the practice of letting livestock roam freely to devour young saplings.
He wove it into the cultural fabric, establishing a tradition where every wedding, every birth, and every graduation was celebrated by planting a tree.
He also targeted the deeply entrenched dependency on foreign textiles. He issued a mandate requiring public officials to wear the Faso d'Anfani.
That's a tunic made entirely from locally grown, locally woven Burkinabè cotton.
It stimulated the domestic agricultural sector, empowered local weavers, who are mostly women, and functioned as a daily, physical manifestation of national pride. You literally couldn't walk into a government building wearing imported French suits.
And that leads directly to the most radical, unprecedented pillar of the revolution, which the sources highlight extensively: women's liberation.
Yeah, in the 1980s, many revolutionary movements paid lip service to gender equality, but functionally subordinated it to class struggle.
But Sankara explicitly targeted patriarchy as the foundational infrastructure of capitalist exploitation.
He banned female genital mutilation, he outlawed forced marriages.
He made polygamy illegal.
He actively recruited women into the military, arguing that women needed the training to defend the revolution just as much as men. He appointed women to unprecedented, high-level cabinet positions.
Feminist scholars analyzing Sankara's texts point out his profound epistemological challenge. He didn't just ask women to step up, he demanded that men fundamentally dismantle their own privilege.
He argued that men must actively unlearn their patriarchal conditioning to truly become human.
He saw gender equality not as an auxiliary goal to be handled after the economy was fixed, but as the very engine required to fix the economy in the first place.
Yeah.
You cannot double your nation's output if half your population is subjugated as property.
Right. But we have to look at the mechanics of forcing this kind of rapid, totalizing change. Sankara is sprinting at a breakneck pace.
Yes, he is.
He is vaccinating millions, planting forests, banning ancient cultural practices like polygamy, and stripping wealth from the elite. You can't just mandate a complete overhaul of human behavior overnight without massive friction.
No, you can't.
And the historical record, according to the sources, shows a deeply authoritarian dark side to this madness. Wasn't this all incredibly forced?
The text acknowledged this fatal flaw. To bypass the sluggish, often corrupt state bureaucracy, Sankara established the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, or CDRs.
Right.
On paper, these were supposed to be organs of popular sovereignty local councils where villagers debated policy and organized labor. But in practice, you are handing weapons and broad policing authority to thousands of young, zealous men with minimal training.
The CDRs rapidly mutated into armed vigilante groups. They were given the mandate to root out counter-revolutionaries. They set up popular revolutionary tribunals to try corrupt officials.
Well, the logistics of these tribunals were fundamentally flawed. They lacked basic due process, often relying on public shaming, hearsay, and mob justice rather than evidentiary law.
Sankara's militaristic rigor blinded him to the political fallout. The CDRs began to actively alienate massive segments of the population.
They clashed violently with the powerful trade unions, who saw their traditional collective bargaining power being usurped by these armed committees.
Thousands of teachers went on strike to protest the heavy-handed tactics, and Sankara responded by firing them en masse, replacing them with underqualified loyalists.
The traditional tribal chiefs, furious at having their land and privileges stripped, quietly turned their rural constituencies against the government. And the urban middle class lived in terror of being hauled before a tribunal for perceived bourgeois tendencies.
So he was alienating the exact people he needed to keep the state running. He was isolating himself internally, entirely dependent on his own charisma and the loyalty of the military to hold the country together.
And while the internal foundations were cracking, he was making incredibly powerful, highly motivated enemies on the global stage.
Geopolitically, Thomas Sankara was an unacceptable variable in the Cold War equation. He was the definition of a threat to the global status quo.
If his model of endogenous development succeeded, it would prove to the rest of the continent that the IMF, the World Bank, and the neo-colonial currency pegs were not necessary for survival.
And he wasn't just quietly building this alternative, he was publicly humiliating the architects of the global order. The sources detail the climax of this defiance in 1986 during a state visit by the French president, François Mitterrand.
The setting is an official state dinner in Ouagadougou. Mitterrand is the guest of honor, representing the former colonial master, the controller of the CFA Franc.
Sankara stands up at the podium. With Mitterrand sitting just feet away, looking completely impassive, Sankara looks him directly in the eye and unleashes a blistering critique of French foreign policy.
Right to his face.
Right to his face. He attacks France for hosting Peter Botha, the leader of apartheid South Africa, and Jonas Savimbi, the Angolan rebel leader. Sankara points at Mitterrand and calls these men killers whose hands are covered with blood, demanding to know how France could allow such butchers to walk freely in their country.
Mitterrand famously replied later in the evening with this tight diplomatic understatement, calling Sankara a somewhat troublesome man.
But behind closed doors in Paris, the French intelligence apparatus, the DGSE, was in a state of deep alarm.
The French geopolitical strategy in Africa, known as France-Afrique, relied entirely on a network of compliant African dictators who kept French corporations enriched and French military bases open. Sankara was threatening to trigger a massive domino effect that could collapse the entire CFA Franc zone.
France had the motive, but they needed local assets to execute a containment strategy, and they found their anchor right next door in the Ivory Coast.
The president of the Ivory Coast, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, was the absolute pillar of conservative pro-Western politics in West Africa. He viewed Sankara as a radical, contagious virus.
One that could easily infect the massive population of Burkinabè migrant workers living in the Ivory Coast, destabilizing his own deeply unequal capitalist regime.
So Houphouët-Boigny and the French DGSE began actively coordinating to isolate Burkina Faso economically and politically.
Normally, a Marxist-leaning revolutionary in the 1980s facing Western hostility would immediately secure a security guarantee from the Soviet bloc. But Sankara refused to play the Cold War proxy game.
He explicitly rejected the Soviet model of top-down state communism, insisting Burkina Faso would forge its own unique, non-aligned path,
which deeply alienated the USSR. In fact, the texts note the Soviet Union ended up covertly supporting the communist trade unions that were actively striking against Sankara's government.
He also alienated Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi envisioned himself as the grand orchestrator of a massive pan-Islamic anti-Western coalition stretching across the Sahara.
He poured weapons and money into various insurgencies, and he wanted to use Burkina Faso as a vital geographic staging ground to funnel arms to rebels in Chad and Liberia.
But Sankara recognized Gaddafi's megalomania and flatly refused to let his country be used as a proxy battleground for Libyan ambitions.
So the geopolitical map is entirely red. He has alienated the West, the Soviet bloc, the Libyans, his conservative neighbors, and his own domestic middle class. He is completely surrounded.
And the pressure point that the intelligence agencies identify to crack the regime open is his absolute closest friend.
The man who marched on the capital to put him in power, Blaise Compaoré.
Compaoré was the military muscle of the revolution. While Sankara was giving speeches and planting trees, Compaoré was managing the intelligence apparatus and the special forces.
And their relationship, while deeply fraternal, was fracturing. Compaoré was significantly closer to the conservative elements in the region.
Crucially, his wife was a direct protege of the Ivorian president. As Sankara's isolation peaked, the external forces found a willing conspirator in Compaoré, who realized that sticking with Sankara likely meant going down with the ship.
The mechanics of the assassination plot are deeply tangled, but testimony from the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission alongside declassified intelligence maps out the web.
You have the warlord Charles Taylor, who is plotting a massive, bloody insurgency to take over Liberia. Taylor needs a staging ground, weapons, and money. He goes to Gaddafi in Libya.
Gaddafi agrees to fund Taylor, but they need a transit route through West Africa. Sankara refuses to allow it.
But Blaise Compaoré quietly reaches out. The texts indicate Compaoré agrees to give Charles Taylor and Gaddafi the logistical support they need for the Liberian War on one dark condition.
They provide the ruthless mercenary muscle needed to eliminate Thomas Sankara.
So you have Liberian mercenaries, funded by Libyan oil money, operating on behalf of Compaoré.
And operating in the shadows above all of this is the French DGSE and the CIA, who, according to former operatives cited in the sources, were fully aware of the impending coup and actively ensured that the intelligence blind spots were maintained so the hit could happen without interference.
As one intelligence source described the operation, the piano was tuned both by the Americans and the French.
The timeline converges on Thursday, October 15th, 1987. Let's walk through this day because the texts frame it like a literal thriller. Sankara is at the headquarters of the National Council of the Revolution in Ouagadougou.
He is in a small meeting room with his closest aides, desperately drafting a new political framework to rein in the CDRs, ease the political tensions with the unions, and stabilize the country.
He knew the rumors of a coup led by Compaoré were everywhere. His internal security chiefs had begged him for weeks to preemptively arrest Compaoré.
But Sankara had explicitly forbidden it, stating, "Friendship cannot be betrayed." He knew the strike was coming, but he refused to pull the trigger on his brother.
Suddenly, the sound of heavy automatic gunfire erupts in the courtyard. The Commando unit, heavily armed and backed by the mercenaries, storms the compound.
They immediately shoot Sankara's driver and his personal guards dead.
Inside the meeting room, the surviving witness, Haluna Traoré, reported that everyone froze in terror. Sankara slowly stood up from the table. He looked at his aides and said, "Stay here. It's me they're looking for."
He opens the door and steps out of the room. He raises his hands high above his head in a gesture of total, peaceful surrender.
The Commando unit does not attempt to arrest him. They immediately open fire with Kalashnikovs.
For decades, the exact details of his death were suppressed. It wasn't until 2015, when his remains were finally exhumed, that the autopsy revealed the brutal truth.
His body was completely riddled with 12 bullet holes, and the forensic pathologist confirmed the witness accounts. There was a specific bullet hole located directly under his armpit.
Ballistically, a bullet can only enter the body at that exact angle if the victim's arms are raised straight up in the air in surrender.
He was executed in cold blood. 12 of his aides and guards were slaughtered alongside him.
Blaise Compaoré immediately seizes control of the radio stations. He broadcasts to the nation, claiming that Sankara was a traitor, leading the country to economic ruin.
In an act of profound obscenity, he forces a local military doctor to falsify the official death certificate, legally declaring that Sankara, a remarkably fit 37-year-old man who had just absorbed a dozen assault rifle rounds, died of natural causes.
Sankara's body is hastily thrown into the back of a truck and dumped into an unmarked shallow grave in the dead of night outside the city limits.
Compaoré officially declares a program called the rectification of the revolution, which mechanically meant the total systemic dismantling of every single thing Sankara had built.
He immediately brings the IMF and the World Bank back into the country. He reverses the land reforms, handing power back to the tribal chiefs. He reverses the bans on imported goods.
He enriches himself, his family, and his inner circle, ruling Burkina Faso as a highly corrupt, Western-backed autocrat for the next 27 years. For almost 3 decades, speaking Thomas Sankara's name aloud in Burkina Faso could get you arrested or disappeared.
They tried to pave over his memory entirely.
But the sources make a fascinating point here. You cannot assassinate an ideology that is rooted in material reality. The poverty, the extraction, the neocolonial structures, they all snapped violently back into place under Compaoré.
The material conditions that birthed Sankara's revolution remained completely unresolved, simmering just beneath the surface for 27 years.
And in 2014, the pressure cooker finally explodes.
Blaise Compaoré, aging and deeply unpopular, attempts to force through a constitutional amendment that would allow him to extend his decades-long rule even further.
The youth of Burkina Faso, a massive demographic bulge of people who were not even born when Sankara was murdered, flood the streets of Ouagadougou.
And the aesthetic and ideological core of this massive uprising is overwhelmingly Sankarist. The youth are wearing red berets, they're wearing T-shirts emblazoned with Sankara's face.
They are blasting recordings of his 1980 speeches through loudspeakers. The vanguard organizing these protests is a grassroots coalition called Balai Citoyen, which translates to the Citizen's Broom.
They were taking to the streets to literally sweep away the entrenched corruption of the Compaoré regime.
When Compaoré's security forces deployed tear gas and live ammunition, the crowds refused to disperse. They utilized a deeply chilling local proverb to articulate their fearlessness. A dead baby goat is no longer afraid of the knife.
When you have been stripped of your economic future, your political agency, and your basic dignity, you no longer fear the weapons of the state. You have nothing left to lose.
The sheer scale and absolute fearlessness of the protests overwhelmed the security apparatus, the military fractures. Blaise Compaoré, the man who betrayed Sankara, is forced to resign in disgrace and flees across the border into the Ivory Coast,
Seeking protection from the very political establishment that helped him seize power decades earlier.
The youth of Burkina Faso ousted the assassin. It is a monumental, cathartic victory. But as the texts explore, removing a corrupt autocrat is relatively simple compared to the mechanics of rebuilding a collapsed state.
Over the next 8 years, the democratic transition flounders. The deeply entrenched economic structures remain, and a new, terrifying variable enters the equation.
A massive, incredibly brutal jihadist insurgency, fueled by the collapse of Libya and spilling over from neighboring Mali, begins systematically tearing the Sahel region apart.
The insurgency feeds on the exact rural poverty and state absence that Sankara had warned about.
The democratically elected government proves entirely incapable of securing the countryside. A subsequent military coup also fails to stem the bleeding. Entire villages are massacred, and millions of people become internally displaced refugees. The state is quite literally disintegrating.
This chaos brings us to September 2022. Out of the vacuum of a collapsing state steps a 34-year-old military captain named Ibrahim Traoré.
He commands a specialized counterterrorism unit called the Cobras. He marches into the capital, topples the transitional government, and assumes total power, becoming the youngest head of state in the world.
And Traoré looks directly at the historical playbook. He immediately assumes the aesthetic and rhetorical mantle of Thomas Sankara.
The parallels in the sources are heavily cultivated and highly deliberate. Traoré, taking power in his early 30s as a charismatic military captain, immediately targets French neocolonialism.
He leverages the intense, widespread public anger over France's failure to defeat the jihadists. In a dramatic, highly publicized move, he orders the complete withdrawal of the French military's counterterrorism task force from Burkinabè soil.
France, facing immense geopolitical pressure, is forced to pack up its bases and leave.
He mimics Sankara's economic defiance as well, publicly rejecting structural adjustment funds and criticizing Western economic models.
Geopolitically, he executes a massive realignment. He allies with the military juntas that recently seized power in neighboring Mali and Niger. Together, they form the Alliance of Sahel States, or the AES.
They announce they are completely withdrawing from the Western-backed regional bloc ECOWAS. They declare, "We are breaking away from Western security architectures. We are doing this ourselves."
And to fill the massive security and economic vacuum left by the expulsion of the French, Traoré pivots sharply eastward. The texts detail how he begins forging deep military and economic partnerships with Russia,
Specifically utilizing Russian paramilitary forces for security, while expanding mining and infrastructure deals with China and Turkey. It is a complete systemic rupture of the France-Afrique architecture.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. You are mapping Traoré's actions perfectly onto Sankara's anti-imperialist rhetoric. But look at the mechanics of his actual governance.
Right.
Our sources highlight that Traoré's regime is heavily securitized. He has suspended the constitution. He is delaying democratic elections indefinitely. So isn't he simply using the beloved ghost of Thomas Sankara as an ideological shield to legitimize what is fundamentally just another military dictatorship?
That is the defining analytical debate among Sahel observers today. The sources highlight a profound structural difference between the two regimes. It is undeniable that Traoré has tapped into a deeply valid, historically justified Pan-Africanist fury.
Because the population is exhausted by decades of Western hypocrisy, extractive economics, and the complete failure of post-colonial democratic governance to provide basic security.
Yes. Traoré's forceful anti-imperialist posture provides a profound sense of psychological dignity and a clear rupture from a humiliated past.
But the mechanics of the revolution are completely different. Sankara's statecraft, despite its severe authoritarian flaws, was obsessively focused on mass political education and grassroots material transformation.
Right. The entire project was about mobilizing the villages to build schools, plant forests, weave cotton, and emancipate women.
Traoré's regime, by stark contrast, is overwhelmingly defined by the mechanics of war. Burkina Faso is fighting for its literal survival against the jihadist insurgency.
Traoré utilizes a political framework known in the texts as revolutionary time. It is a permanent, institutionalized state of emergency. He frames the nation as being locked in an existential dual struggle against both Western imperial domination and radical insurgency.
And because the threat is existential and immediate, the emergency legally and morally justifies the indefinite suspension of civil liberties, the Constitution, and the electoral process.
The promised future of a thriving egalitarian society is constantly referenced, but its delivery is continually suspended until the revolution and the war are won.
He is wielding the symbolism of Sankara's revolution to legitimize military rule without necessarily executing the inclusive, participatory social programs that define Sankara's actual time and power.
He is treating the brutal symptoms of state collapse with overwhelming military force. But the sources question whether he is actually curing the underlying economic and social diseases.
To be clear, we are examining the mechanics of how power is being wielded and justified through the lens of historical analysis, not taking a side on the deeply complex politics of a nation at war.
Of course. The geopolitical consensus in the source material is that anti-imperialism, when decoupled from inclusive institutions and transparent, accountable governance, risks degrading into a mere legitimizing discourse for authoritarianism.
Traoré has undeniably achieved the systemic rupture with the West that Sankara dreamed of. The French are gone.
But whether Traoré's military junta can build a functioning, equitable, self-reliant society in the ashes of that rupture remains the most uncertain, high-stakes variable in West Africa today.
As we resolve the massive arc we've tracked today, the sheer scale of the history really stands out. Thomas Sankara looked at a starving, thoroughly exploited company town of a country, and he possessed the absolute, uncompromising madness to invent a future totally free of imperial control.
He proved, mechanically and logistically, that a self-reliant African economy was possible. He vaccinated the children, he planted the trees, he clothed his people.
And though he was brutally murdered by his best friend in a desperate bid by global capital to maintain the status quo, his ideas proved entirely bulletproof.
They haunted the autocrat who replaced him, they provided the ideological fire for the 2014 uprising, and they are the exact blueprint being cited in the massive geopolitical shifts tearing through the Sahel right now.
Sankara recognized the fundamental truth that political independence is an illusion without the complete severing of the economic and psychological chains of colonialism, which leaves us with a final, heavy question. Something to examine when you look at how the global economy functions today. We have seen the mathematical trap of playing by the rules of global finance nations locked into debt, forced to export their wealth while their people starve. But we have also seen exactly what the global system does to a leader who tries to completely break those rules. Sankara was economically isolated, he was forced into authoritarian measures to defend his fragile state, and ultimately he was violently eradicated. If true decolonization requires a total rupture from the global economic machine, is it actually possible for any developing nation to achieve it without being utterly isolated or forced into permanent dictatorship just to survive the inevitable backlash? The answer to that question is currently being written in blood and rhetoric in the streets of Ouagadougou. See you next time with more such stories.